Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our fourth Heritage Month event, Asian Americans in Movement, featuring Bob Wing and Manju Rajendran. We're going to first hear a little bit from Bob around more of the historical piece regarding Asian American movement building, especially in those early days when the movement first came together. Then we'll pass to Manju to hear more about kind of current and local work that's going on, and then we'll put the two in conversation for a panel and Q&A session. So just to provide a little more context on North Carolina Asian Americans Together, many of you are familiar with our work, but for those who aren't, North Carolina Asian Americans Together is a Pan-Asian nonprofit based in North Carolina that works through civic engagement, grassroots mobilization, and leadership development and community building across different Asian American communities in North Carolina. And I will pass it to Bob and let Bob introduce himself to y'all.
Whoa, okay. I guess you're counting on everybody being on time. Wow. Hi, everyone. My name is Bob Wing, and I want to thank Asian Americans Together for inviting me to participate together with my good friend Manju. I really miss Durham. I lived there for 5 years between 2010 and 2015. And I only moved back to help take custody of my goddaughter. Otherwise, I'd still be there. I still have my 919 phone number. So I don't know, introducing myself, I was part of the very beginning of the Asian American movement and have stayed a racial justice activist all this time, now 53 years. 53 years, I am old. And I guess some of the highlights of what you might have known about that I have done is I was the national co-chair of the biggest anti-war in Iraq coalition. I was the founder of Color Lines magazine, which is a magazine about racial justice, which is now online. It started as a print publication. There in North Carolina, some of the groups I worked with the Durham People's Alliance. I worked with the Organized 2020, which is a teachers caucus where they've just won the leadership of the North Carolina Association of Educators, the teachers union there in North Carolina. And I was in on the pre-work that led to the Carolina Federation. So there's some, and I was, of course, I worked with the Moral Monday movement and was one of the Moral Monday defendants. So should I just launch in? Okay, why don't you go ahead and put up the slides then? You can go ahead and put up the slideshow. Okay, go to the first slide. So this is just a little bit about me to start out with. I'm a 5th generation Chinese American. Actually, my ancestors came during the period where, due to racism, the United States had passed the Chinese and then the Asian Exclusion Acts, which barred people of Asian descent from entering the United States. And those who were here beforehand or who dribbled in illegally were barred from becoming citizens. This pretty much lasted from about 1882 to about 1960. And my ancestors came in that period, and they came illegally. They were undocumented immigrants. So the whole movement of immigrants and for a path to citizenship is something that I feel very strongly about for both political and personal reasons. Just to give you a flavor of what the early Asian American movement is like, I'm just going to tell you a very quick story about myself. And this is how I think what happened to me was not that unusual in its rapidity. I was a senior in high school in 1967 and 1968 in Sacramento. And you may remember that was the year that Bobby Kennedy and especially Martin Luther King were assassinated. I went to the main school in Sacramento that had Black students, And the day after Dr. King was assassinated, a whole lot of the Black students came to school with Black armbands on. And I was so completely out of it, so unconscious about what was going on in the world, that I had to ask them why they wore armbands. I mean, I was just like that. And then literally less than 1 year from when I was asking why Black students would wear armbands, um, I was engaged in a pitched fight for ethnic studies in the Third World Strike at the University of California at Berkeley, a struggle in which we faced more than 10,000 armed men every day with helicopters and tanks. That was the rapidity of the change that I went through and that many people went through, and especially in that period, uh, tens of thousands of Asians who developed a new identity of Asian American and proceeded into the struggle. So that's just kind of how rapid and how powerful this movement was. It could take somebody like me and turn me into a completely different person with a different outlook on life that is stuck. Why don't you go ahead and go to the next slide? So just some of the kind of markers of what happened in the early Asian American movement. I mean, first of all, the Asian American movement, I mean, the term Asian American didn't exist. No one identified as Asian unless they were from, they were talking about Asia over there. And even then people identified by their nations and nationalities, not as Asian per se, especially since a lot of those countries were fighting each other for many years. So, people identified as Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. That's who the only Asians in the country at the time were really Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino. Today, there are dozens of Asian ethnicities in the United States. So the Asian American movement was the first time that people identified not just as Chinese, like in my case, but in some ways, even more importantly, as an Asian. And what that meant was that we understood that the history of racism in the United States had treated Asians alike, had treated us similarly, and that our destinies were tied together, and that we were prepared to unite ourselves in a new political identity as Asian American to fight against racism and for justice in the country. The very first Asian American organization was formed in Berkeley in the summer of 1968. It was the Asian American Political Alliance at the University of California. And it was just 15 or 20 people in this thing, and school was even out. Yet the whole concept of Asian people so many people were so ready for it that it literally caught fire. By the fall quarter in school, Yellow Identity and Asian American Identity conferences were being held all over the country with hundreds and thousands of participants at a time. It was incredibly exciting. Most of the participants were young people. Many were college students, but there was also a significant movement towards the Asian American identity in some of the working class Asian communities. So it was like, it's like lightning had struck us, and it was just amazing to be part of. Um, so then what really gave content to the movement were the Third World strikes. The Third World strikes were student strikes calling for the establishment of ethnic studies programs. The first one happened at San Francisco State in the fall of 1968, and it was led by a coalition called the Third World Coalition, the Third World Liberation Front. And Third World at that time meant it's basically what we now call people of color. Third World meant people of color. And so it was led by the Black student organizations, the Latino student organizations, the Asian student organizations, and the Native American student organizations. And together they united as the Third World Liberation Front and fought for ethnic studies, which would have divisions devoted to the study and the uplift of each of the different communities. So the Asian American was born at the same time as the concept of third world. Third world had been used to talk about external, about countries in the dependent countries in the world, but it had never been used to unite people of color across racial lines within the United States. So Asian American was completely attached to the concept of third world, to the solidarity, which again, as I said, today the term is people of color. And third world, we use third world because we not only identified with people of color inside the United States, but with our home countries and the liberation of our home countries. But anyway, these strikes were, as I said, they were powerful events. I mean, one day I'm walking a picket line, passing out a leaflet, purely trying to educate people about the need for ethnic studies, or what we called then a third world college. And the next thing I know, I mean, thousands of police are unleashed upon us. And the strike at San Francisco State and Berkeley, the Berkeley strike started the next quarter, in the winter quarter of 1969. They lasted the entire term of school. And both were victorious, and these were the origins of the first ethnic studies departments in the United States. Um, so the third world strike kind of put people into action. Before that, we would be talking about our identity, and we'd be talking about racism and the struggle against racism, but the strikes put people into action in a very serious way, and up against a very powerful and and vicious opponent, meaning at that time Ronald Reagan was the governor, and he was the one responsible for putting all those armed people against us every day. So then the other kind of big, and then after the victory of Asian American Studies, a lot of students started to participate in building the Asian American Studies programs all over the West Coast, and to some degree in Chicago and New York. Um, one of the other big activities of the early Asian movement were Asian American anti-war contingents. This was during the Indochina War, the Vietnam War, which in 1970 expanded when Nixon bombed Cambodia, and it became the war in Indochina. And we had the most exciting contingents of Asian Americans in these huge anti-war demonstrations. And again, this is what gave content to what it meant to be Asian American. And very soon after, especially after the third world strikes, both students tended to unite and refocus off the campuses. They stayed on campuses, but there was a big refocus off the campus into the communities to try to organize in the Chinatowns, the Manila towns, the little Tokyos and Japantowns across the country. So very quickly by 1969, Asian American organizations were being put together in many of the Asian communities, especially in the large cities. And probably the most famous of those was the fight for the International Hotel in San Francisco, Chinatown. And I guess also, I mean, a lot of times people don't know that the Filipinos were actually the ones who started the Great Boycott, which was then joined by the United Farm Workers and became the United Farm Workers, one of the biggest movements at the time. And of course, Asians were strongly involved in that, in supporting the Filipino farm workers. So those were some of the kind of main activities that shaped what the early Asian American movement looked like. So why did this happen? And just very briefly, I mean, this is a fairly simplistic answer, but probably touches the high points. The Asian American movement, in my opinion, was basically caused by the confluence of three things. First, the Black civil rights and Black power movements. Of course, the civil rights movement, although it's called the 60s, started in 1955 with the Montgomery bus boycott. And the Black movements showed the entire country that we should all look at what was going on that was unjust, whether it was happening to us, our neighbors, or our friends, and that we could successfully get together and fight back and win. This was a huge thing. The Black movement essentially gave rise to the women's movement. It essentially gave rise to the Asian American and Latino movements. It essentially gave rise to the gay liberation movement and gave much power to the anti-war movement. The second factor was the Vietnam War. Back in those days, they actually used to show wars on television. In your lifetime, they've never shown a war on television. They wouldn't, they even during the second war in Iraq, the government barred photographs or footage of even caskets, let alone the actual war. During the Vietnam War, every night for years on the news, they would be showing footage of the war in which, hundreds or thousands of people were being killed on television every day. It was, they really literally showed hundreds of people getting killed. And they didn't sanitize the war the way they have done with the war in Iraq and other wars since. And so especially this hit Asians like a ton of bricks because they look just like us. We were like wondering what in the heck, why are they doing this? And it added to the rage, especially as we delved into our own histories and the social conditions in the Chinatowns and Manila towns that we hadn't been particularly aware of, or if we were aware of them, we just kind of accepted as the way of life. And then the third factor was by 1965 was the first time that American-born Asians were the majority of Asians. And there were only 1.2 million Asians in that year. Again, as I said, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese. But for the entire history of Asians before that, people born in Asia were the vast majority. And of course, there becomes a big change when it's an American-born, when the American-born become a larger and larger part or a majority of the population, because they don't have any ideas that they're necessarily going back to Asia. This is where they're going to live, and this is where they have to make a life. This is what's going on now with the millions and millions of Asians who've come since the 1965 immigration reform. Every year, more and more Asians realize that their life is here and they've got to make it as good as possible, and it's giving new energy to the Asian American movement. Okay, next slide. Here's where I want to play the song. So are you ready to play the song? I wanted to play this song, which really was the anthem of the Asian American movement. And I think will give you a sense of what the feeling and the politics and the content of that early Asian American movement was like. Go ahead. It's called We Are the Children, done by the first ever Asian American group, singing group.
You hear it?
I can't hear anything.
Oh no, give me a moment.
Uh-huh.
Now hear but not see.
We are the children of the migrant worker. We are the offspring of the concentration camp, sons and daughters of the railroad builder, who leave their stamp on America. We are the children of the Chinese waiter, born and raised in the laundry room. We are the offspring of the Japanese gardener, who leave their stamp on America. Sing a song for ourselves. What have we got to lose? Sing a song for ourselves. We got the right to choose. We got the right to choose. We got the right to choose. Foster children of the Pepsi generation, cowboys and Indians ride, red men ride. Hey, watching war movies with the next door neighbor, secretly rooting for the other side. Sing a song for ourselves. What have we got to lose? Sing a song for ourselves. We got the right to choose. We got the right to choose. We got the right to choose. We are the cousins of the freedom fighter, brothers and sisters all around the world. We are a part of the third world people who will leave their stamp on America. Who will leave their stamp on America. Who will leave our stamp on America. Who will leave our stamp on America. America.
Thank you. You can go ahead and put the slides back up. That gives you a very strong sense of what the movement was like prior to that time. For most Asians, being the son or daughter of somebody who was in the relocation camps was something to hide. To be born in a laundry or a restaurant was something to hide. To be a farm worker, a migrant farm worker, was something to hide and to be ashamed of. And the whole movement, the Asian American movement, changed all that. We celebrated it instead of feeling ashamed about it. And we're ready to fight to make our lives better. So I'm just going to end fairly quickly here with just a comment about the future, which Manju is going to then take up. This is just a short comment. We live in an incredibly consequential, really a landmark period in American history. I mean, the Trumpists not only are touting and basing their whole program on racist authoritarianism, they even attacked the Capitol and threatened to literally overthrow the government. And they have no apologies about it. And they're going about trying to institute voter suppression in a way that they can win next time. And if they don't win, they may even launch a stronger attack on democracy. But in this kind of a situation, we're really posed with racist authoritarianism or a multiracial democracy. And Asians have grown from 1.2 million people in 1965 to somewhere in the range of 22 million people today. Most people realize that that was a result of the 1965 Immigration Act, but a lot of people don't know that the 1965 Immigration Act was part of the civil rights movement. It was caused by the civil rights movement to do away with racism as much as possible, not only within the United States, but in immigration policy. And it's that change in immigration policy that happened that's given rise to the tremendous growth of Asians in the United States, as well as Latinos and people from other parts of the world who were almost completely invisible, including, like I said, dozens of Asian nationalities now in the United States. One of the great things that's happened has been the change in the politics of many Asian Americans in the United States. Historically, when we were a very small number, most Asians, like most immigrants, were Democrats. But when Nixon went to China and other things happened and Asians became more affluent, Asians moved strongly towards the Republican Party in the 80s and 90s. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton only received about 37% of the vote of Asian Americans. But by the time we got to Obama, 70% of Asian Americans were voting Democratic as they saw the dangers coming from the Republican Party's attacks on immigrants, on people of color, on the level of inequality. So there's been a drastic change in the politics of Asian Americans, and puts us in a position, if we can sustain it and build on it, to play a very important role in the movement to to maintain democracy and to fight racism in the United States. I mean, we're at a particular moment where that's even more heightened by the incredible number of anti-Asian attacks that have taken place in the last couple of years. Here we are probably the most, and not probably, we are Asians, the most educated group of people. Not that all are educated, but our educational level is the highest educational level in the United States. And the educational level of immigrants is even higher than Asian Americans. Now, according to the myth of meritocracy in the United States, that means that everything should be terrific for Asians. Yet here we are under attack from people, from racists all over the country. And this is what happens. Immigrants come here. This just happened to Arabs recently. Most of the Arabs who came to the United States were actually Christians and voted Republican. And then 2001 happened, September 11th happened, and there were attacks on Muslims and Arabs all over the country. And they were also a very highly educated elite group of people. And boom, there was a big political turnaround. Somehow in this country, racism always manages to tell people of color that they're people of color and subject to attack, even when we don't understand it ourselves. And eventually we do come to understand it ourselves. So this is a huge moment with these attacks in the situation of the attack on democracy, where Asian Americans need to need to and can rise to the occasion, and not only to defend ourselves, but be a very important part of fighting for a multiracial democracy in the country. That's it. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much for that powerful presentation and all of that history. I was literally, I'm dramatic, but I was literally tearing up at certain points. It's just like, I don't know. It's like history that I've like always looked up to and been really inspired by. So seeing somebody talk about it, you know, from that perspective was a real honor for me, truly. Yeah, thank you for that. I will now pass to Manju to talk a little bit about her current movement organizing.
Hi, I'm Manju Rajendran. I live in Durham, and I am so honored to be in conversation with you, Zia, and with you, Uncle Bob, and with this amazing room of folks, many of whom I know and adore. And please pardon the dinner time sounds happening behind me. Uncle Bob always knows what time it is, and for like 20 years I have definitely, like from afar and then from close up, really looked to him to understand what is going on in our political moment and what is the best course of action for our movements. And so it feels a little silly to be talking about current organizing. Uncle Bob could definitely be the one focusing on important work that's happening in this political moment. Are y'all able to hear me okay? Great. I wanted to lift a few threads that felt connected between your story and mine, Uncle Bob. My mother and father came to the States from Bombay, but both my parents are originally from Kerala, which is the first place in the world where a communist party organization was elected into political power, and they came as immigrants with papers. But when my mom left my father, she became undocumented, and wanted to point out that connection of politicization around undocumented immigrant origins and how those lineages connect us to other undocumented immigrants across nationality, being politicized through Pan-Asian American community as a teen and 20-something movements that Uncle Bob helped build. noticing our left lineages in our Asian Pacific origins, places of origin, um, learning in solidarity with Black liberation organizing movements. The first place that I ever heard of Bob Wing was picking up a paper called War Times, that was this incredible journal that came out of anti-war organizing from the early 2000s. And I think you were the editor. Is that true? Yeah, one of the co-founders and editors. Um, and yeah, just hearing this echo from being politicized around the Vietnam War as a movement, where the television showed war on people who looked like us back then, and then activation for my teen and 20-something cohort around the wars on Afghanistan and Iraq, where the television avoided showing the war on people who look like us. So fast forwarding to this present moment in 2021, where I am working very hard as part of Durham Beyond Policing Coalition with many folks who are in the room. Maybe we can just pop into gallery view. And if you are part of Durham Beyond Policing, would you just share your hand in real life, or you could use the reaction symbol to do a little clap. So we could just see, shout out to Zia and to Mab and who else? Hung On, Grace, and probably others of you. I want to just share a little bit about our work. This is my kiddo, Azadi. Do you want to wave hi to our buddies? These are friends from the North Carolina Asian Americans Together and friends. I'm just going to share my screen to share some images from the work of Durham Beyond Policing. This is some of our fam. If you are local, you probably recognize some of the amazing beloveds here gathered on the steps of inside of City Hall. This was a powerful moment for Durham Beyond Policing. This wasn't our origin moment as a formation. Yes, Mab is pointing out in the chat that we look a little less weathered, a little less pandemicked in this image. We had just flooded City Hall with public comments and had spilled out into the hallway, and we're reviving our formation around stopping a push from Durham Police Department to hire 72 new police officers. So we were actually formed a few years before that image that I just showed you in 2016, and we were formed to divest from policing and prisons around this idea of abolition, the principle that knowing real safety lies in systems of care, solidarity, and community accountability, and not systems of punishment or disposability of our beloved community. And also around the idea of investing public resources into supporting the health and well-being of Black and Brown communities, benefiting everyone in Durham. Thank you, Mab. Take care. So sharing a few notes about how we got here. We formed in the beginning as a coalition of Black Youth Project 100, Southerners on New Ground, UE 150, which is the local city workers union, with major support from Triangle Surge. We pushed back against the construction of the Durham Police Department's $71.3 million new police headquarters. And you see this banner in which people are saying, if we had the $71.3 million that y'all are about to spend on a giant flossy new building, we would rather spend that money on housing, jobs, food, education, childcare. So Durham Beyond Policing began in these conversations at bus stations, out on the street, door knocking, talking to people about this question: how would you rather reallocate public funds? And we think that's a really great starting place for a conversation. We rarely hear people say that what helps them feel safer is cops or prisons or war. And this was in front of that old police headquarters. People locked themselves to the entrance. And fast forwarding to 2019, we were able to push back against their request to fund an additional 72 new cops. And we won big because we were able to connect the dots between the amount of money it would take to hire 72 new police officers. If we were to not spend that money, we would have the money we needed to make it possible for every city worker to get $15 an hour minimum, including part-time workers who had been left behind in earlier wage increases, funding for eviction diversion, which our dear shared friend, Ray Earhart, who was a real central strategist in the work of Durham Beyond Policing, kept reminding us, like, this work around eviction diversion and affordable housing is so central to the question of stable communities. True safety lies in helping people be able to stay in their homes. Like, fighting gentrification is an abolition fight. And that is what it would take to make it possible to have no new cops. And that logic was impossible for them to argue with. So what we're doing is we're taking these really kind of long range revolutionary goals, and we're trying to lay them out in really practical terms inside of a year-to-year budget fight, in logic that is irrefutable. And we're using this divest invest framework that is that ties together the movement for Black Lives work across the country. Divesting looks like cutting the budgets, for example, of the Sheriff's Department, the County Jail, the Durham Police Department, school resource officers, the youth jail, the new youth jail that they are talking about spending over $30 million building instead of investing in public education. And I mean, what we're talking about is that keeping a youth incarcerated in our youth jail costs over $300 a night. Investing more deeply in schools, if we were doing that to the tune of $300 per student per day, can you imagine? Like, it's just a real misplacement of resources. So that investment, when we talk to community residents, what we hear is it's about affordable and comfortable housing, it's about delicious, healthy, culturally appropriate food, thriving wages, universal basic income, free 24-hour mental health care, care workers, not cops, school guidance counselors, peer mediators. So these days, our primary work is centered around the Community Safety and Wellness Task Force, which was a victory we won when we realized we don't want to just keep fighting the annual request for policing expansion that Durham Police Department and the Sheriff's Department put forth at the city and county budgets every year. We want to create a municipal body that is a connection between city, county, and the school board that is forging a new path that is inside of the paradigm of abolition. And this doesn't replace the informal ways that our communities are taking care of each other, but it's our opportunity to really craft how public resources can be shifted in a major way towards the things that we need. We're doing it through something called the 10 to Transform campaign, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. We're doing Cops Out of Schools work in partnership with the Youth Justice Project at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice and community-led systems of safety. So the community-led Safety and Wellness Task Force grew out of this proposal where we dug in deep to to lay out, there are all of these models in which Durham residents have been practicing keeping each other safe, training each other in de-escalation, developing harm-free zone frameworks through organizations like Spirit House, and that harm-free zone model grows out of the work of critical resistance. We wanted to lay out this model of taking the work that had been happening in a grassroots way through our transformative justice networks in Durham and elevating it to municipal level investment. And so we named some of the priorities: healthcare for all, housing, schools, unionized workplaces, and I'm good, baby, thank you. And often in our meetings with electeds, we hear the reason we can't defund the police yet is because crime is still happening. And we keep pushing back by saying crime prevention is not something that the police are capable of, right? Police can only arrive after an incident has occurred and investigate what's happened. We really lift up the words of one of our favorite elected leaders, Jillian Johnson, our mayor pro tem, who says the safest communities don't have the most cops, they have the most resources. And often what we hear from electeds is, well, what about the great police reform efforts that are underway? And what we push back in saying is that the solutions that are embedded inside of our existing policing structures or our existing jails don't actually address the root causes of violence. They keep the cycles of harm intact, and it's a cycle that keeps escalating. No, thank you, Annie. And in the meantime, we need safe ways to seek help. Can I just ask for a time check, Zia? How am I doing? How much more time?
You're great. It's 6:45.
How much more time do I have? Remind me.
We could go ahead and start the panel at 7, so 15 more minutes.
Okay, fantastic. So let me just share with y'all about the Tend to Transform campaign, which is our budgetary fight at this time. We just had a town hall on Thursday in which all of our city electeds and our county electeds came together with over 150 Durham residents to hear from our folks and learn what they want. We lifted up our two primary demands, which I'll talk about in a moment, and we did this work as Durham Beyond Policing in partnership with our sister organization, Durham for All, which has this multi-issue program and is doing multiracial cross-class organizing for homes for all, education for all, economy for all, sanctuary for all, democracy for all. So this is a layout of our city budget and our county budget, and how all of the things that our municipalities pay for are split over city and county. And the way that this slide is organized, this slide was designed by, no thank you, honey, by Sabah Taj, who you all recently featured when you were highlighting a bunch of amazing Asian American artists in North Carolina. The way that this slide is organized is from very top priority, like which department gets the most money from the city side and which department gets the most money from the county side, and then on down. And it can be a tiny bit confusing because it's really clear on the city side, oh yeah, the police is at the top. They get the lion's share of the budget every year without question. And in fact, when city council members listen to community residents and question it, they receive a lot of flack. Like it is, the police budget is considered sacrosanct. On the Durham County side, it looks a little confusing because you see public schools at the top, you see social services underneath, but to contextualize it, you've got to think about how many individuals, how many Durham residents, how many families are served by the public schools, and how many residents are served by social services. And when you look at this year's Durham County budget, you see that the only two departments that didn't get what they requested in the draft budget are the public schools. They got millions less than what they asked for and what they need. And the libraries, which, I mean, libraries are so important because they contain books, the most like life-saving object in my estimation. But also they are like really important community spaces, right? For folks who are experiencing housing instability, they are where you can go to hop on the computer, to fill out a resume, to get a job, to research things, after school programs, story time, all of that, the literacy work. So when we continue to, hey buddy, I really need quiet right now. So when we continue to systematically underspend on public schools, on libraries, on social services, and continue to allow our sheriff's budget and our jail budget to increase, even in a pandemic where our jail is operating at 50% population, we are setting ourselves up for instability in our society. So here's just a glimpse at the year 2020 to 2021, where you see this was the sheriff's budget compared to the mental health budget. There's this gigantic gulf. And when you look at the next year, the mental health budget is static, and the sheriff's budget continues to increase. We really want robust mental health care that attends to the fact that our folks are struggling and suffering. And I don't know if other folks are part of Asian American peer support spaces, but I am in South Asian spaces and Pan Asian spaces where I'm hearing my peers say our mental health crises are really elevated right now. And we're hearing that across communities of color. We really need robust mental health care investment right now. Over 20% of calls to police are mental health related. 1 out of 4 people who are killed by the cops, and 1 out of 4 people killed by the police, and 1 out of 5 people in prison have a mental illness. When we talk about the Durham County Jail, the people who stay in our jail the longest are folks who have a mental illness or are experiencing a substance use challenge. Individuals with untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by the cops. And these rates should be considered alongside the reality that Black folks are 2 times as likely to be killed by the police. So we want to see 10% of the sheriff's budget and the jail budget moved over to mental health. That's our primary demand on the county side. And this is what that would look like. The sheriff would still have a lot of money. Some of the places where Durham County is spending its money, where we would really love to see increased investment, are behavioral health, urgent care, the 24-hour mobile crisis unit. When we talk to social work fam, they say that sometimes they call the 24-hour mobile crisis unit and it takes 2 hours for the helpers to arrive. It's totally unsustainable. The Recovery Response Center, the Lincoln Community Health Center, where just Thursday at the town hall, we heard a doctor talk about how one of her clients is constantly in and out of prison and jail over substance use challenges, but after being able to access medical care has been able to stabilize his life. He talked about really finding freedom through being able to access medical care. On the city side, we're dealing with a real similar challenge in terms of the lion's share of the budget going towards policing and incarceration models. You see the percentage that's held up by the police budget, and then on the other side, everything else. We want to see 10% of the budget for police officers to be reallocated to the budget for unarmed, skilled care workers in the brand new Department of Community Safety and Wellness, which is a department that has been created to manifest the changes that grew out of the Community Safety and Wellness Task Force work, the 911 calls analysis that's going on. So divesting 10% from the police department, investing that money into hiring for the Department of Community Safety and Wellness. And we want to see unarmed, skilled, compassionate crisis response where in a hard moment on our hardest day, we would be able to pick up the phone and have someone who's really skilled show up and offer help, not show up with guns and escalate a situation. And so part of what that work has looked like, we've been having one-on-ones with our electeds. We've been writing letters, we've been phone banking. In those conversations, over 80% of folks are really amped about alternatives to policing, mental health, and true safety and wellness. If folks want to phone bank with us, please join us. This is the link. It's bit.ly/phone bank. You can sign our letters to City Council and the County Commissioners through this link, and I can share them in the chat. And here is how to stay in touch with Durham Beyond Policing. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Manju. It's great to hear about all the great work y'all are doing at Durham Beyond Policing. Now I'd like to switch gears a little bit and put you and Bob in conversation with each other, if that sounds all right to both of y'all. The first question I kind of have for both of you is, do you have a kind of like story or anecdote or moment of when you kind of first came into movement work?
Should
Go
I
ahead,
go
Manju.
first, or do you want to? Oh,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
okay.
Go ahead.
I first came into movement work when I was 12 and had been encouraged by my parents to speak up at school board meetings around racial injustice in the classroom. My father had been really involved with the local NAACP chapter, and there was a lot of important organizing happening around mistreatment, especially of Black young people in Chapel Oak Harbor schools. And around that time, there was a program proposed called the Leveling Program, where kids who got A's and B's would get rewards and special assemblies and ice cream socials, and kids who got C's and lower would get an escalating level of punishments that would lead ultimately to suspension and then expulsion. And it just seemed like, with the kind of racialized dynamics that we were already seeing in our classrooms, that this kind of punishment and reward system would definitely fall along racial lines and really like not actually give kids of color the kind of support we needed to thrive. And so a bunch of us gathered at this rock over lunch, and we were like, what do we do? And so we passed around this loose leaf paper. We all signed it. This scribbled some notes at the top. It was like my first ever petition. We got a ton of signatures just passing it around in every classroom. And then we had an election the next day, and Jason and I were voted to be the representatives to go speak to the principal. And our principal agreed to sit with us. We walked into his office with like big words scribbled on tiny scraps of paper so that we could pull up big words in case we needed them. I remember that was my first use of the word punitive. And yeah, he really deeply listened to us. He was a Black principal with a really gentle, loving demeanor who just listened to us deeply and ended up agreeing to not do this program that they had announced in a big assembly. And yeah, it kind of got my taste for winning early. I can't wait to hear your story, Uncle Bob.
Well, I mean, I got involved. The first thing I ever got involved with, and it was very lightly, almost like an observer, was in the fall of '68. Some students had put together a course to be led by probably at that time the most famous Black Panther in the country, named Eldridge Cleaver, who had just published a book that had become a bestseller called Soul on Ice. And it was, the administration refused to allow it, even though it was done through the normal channels that were that were open for students to put on courses. And so there was a fight over that lasted there was a strike for about a week. There was barricade fighting. I wasn't involved in that. I was really more like a supporter and more of an observer than an active participant. So I would say really the first time I got involved at the level of being an organizer was during the Third World Strike. Basically, the way this was in the winter of 1969. Basically, the way this strike was organized, I mean, there was many ways in which people participated in the strike. Some people just didn't go to class. They struck going to class. Other people might participate in, helping out with passing leaflets or doing educationals and things like that, and being out at the daily rallies, et cetera, and picket lines that were happening. And then there were those who were kind of the hardcore of it, which were the people who were members of the the people of color student organizations who met every night to try to figure out what was going on, what we were hoping to happen the next day, how we would organize ourselves to try to get it done, et cetera. And, when the strike started, I really was not in the kind of group that was the most organized among Asians. I kind of was a walk-on. I had met people at some of the conferences, and I kind of walked on to the picket lines, and people immediately began to try to get me more organized and to give me opportunities to participate more fully. So I pretty rapidly, I think in the first few days, started attending those meetings that happened every night. Basically the picket lines would be every day, and almost every day around noon, the police and the National Guard would attack us, and all hell would break loose all over basically it was a form of civil war on the campus. And it didn't, the violence didn't break out till the Friday of the first week. So for me, one of the big questions was, once the violence, it was one thing for me to be supportive of the idea of a third world college of ethnic studies, because it was so obvious. I was a history student, and at the time, Berkeley had the top progressive historians of Black history in the entire country. We had the best ones. They were all white, but they were the best ones. And in that department, there was a theory that it was being passed around in history circles, not at Berkeley per se, that slavery was so horrific that had turned all Black people into Sambos. Okay, a Sambo is basically an idiot who can't understand anything and can't fight for themselves, is silly and is manipulated. An entire book was written about that, and even in the history department at Berkeley, that theory got currency. There was not a single book written by a Black person that was taught in the history department, not just in history, in literature. Even though W.E.B. Du Bois is still probably the greatest historian of Black history ever, let alone, James Baldwin in literature, or Zora Neale Hurston. Nothing was taught about Black people or other people of color. There probably weren't 5 books written about Asian Americans in 1968. And if they were certainly weren't taught on the campus. So the idea of an ethnic studies was fairly obvious, at least to me and to many other people. And so it was easy to support the idea, and it was easy to educate people about the need for it. But then when the police attacked us, then it became a whole different thing. I mean, your life was at stake, and your health and happiness, your life and your future. You could get kicked out of that school and never be allowed into another one. It became deadly serious. And I'll never forget making that transition. And you know, it had to be made rapidly. The stuff was not going to wait for me to make my decision. It was happening every day. And I think especially being in the organized group each night, discussing issues out and realizing that the people who were, you know, leading this process were extremely thoughtful and trying to figure out the best way to do things. Were not just crazy. And it gave me faith in the leadership and in the process, and made me a part of it. And so that was really when I first became an organizer. But you know, I was 17 years old. I mean, I was no leader. I was like, there were two of us who were 17, and being 17 meant that we had no legal rights. If we got arrested, we had no legal rights. So people were trying to keep Laurent, was the other guy, Laurent and I, from going out there every day, which of course didn't work. But you know, by hook or by crook or by luck, you know, we survived the process. And yeah, that was really my first. And you know, it's like, it's crazy for that kind of thing to be your first out. It's one of the big differences between the movements recently and the movements back then. The movements back then were immediately, even the civil rights movement, let alone later in the 60s, were immediately met by violence. And, you know, violence was an everyday part of any picket line, of anything that you did. And, you know, that really, so far at least, has not been the case in the United States. So it led to a particular type of political consciousness that, you know, is unusual. And I'm not saying it's better or worse, it just was. And so for me, the whole idea of our armed force being used against you, the FBI. I had a personal FBI agent for 15 years, you know, who followed me for 15 years. All of that was just a matter of the way life was.
And I just want to uplift a comment in the chat in response to your story. Laura said, I can't imagine parents understanding students going on strike. Folks were literally on gap for half a year.
Well, yeah, it was more than half a year, because the Third World Strike was followed immediately the next quarter by the struggle for People's Park at Berkeley. I mean, basically, I was on strike for 8, and it also faced about 10,000 armed men every day. So for 18 out of the 30 weeks, I mean, it was nuts. I mean, I would have never thought of it. It never crossed my mind that I could be involved or would be involved in anything like this, let alone my parents. My parents were scared to death. I mean, I tried to not tell them everything that was going on. I mean, I told them what I thought, but but they'd read about it in the papers and see it on television. It was scary. And, you know, for years and years, it was, my parents were not political people at all. And they were both college educated, but they were not political people. And so, you know, for years and years, I would try to talk to my parents and help them to try to understand what was going on with me. And actually, it was my brother and my sister also ended up lifelong activists. So 3 of the 4 of us. My poor parents would have never thought of this, and I feel for them. And they, you know, it was just not in their experience to really be able to understand, much as they may have tried. But I will say this: my parents always supported us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's powerful. We have another question in the chat. Until recently, it's been hard to come by representation of Asian people in activism. So it's refreshing and exciting to hear your stories. It seems that people often don't want to participate, or when they do, it seems like they're falling short. Why do you think that is, and how can we change that?
I actually feel like maybe the problem lays in the storytelling and the invisibilizing of the critical role that Asian people have played in transformation across the world, in uh, in movements for justice here in the States, and I feel like formations like NCAAT are so important in shifting how the story gets told, um, and really like recentering Asian agency in liberation work, and um, yeah, I feel like the issue is less about our folks doing not enough, and more about better storytelling around what has been, what has come before us, the legacies we have to draw on. I feel like so many of the stories you shared, Uncle Bob, are, you know, ones that definitely go untold and feel really important in a moment like this in North Carolina, where, as Mab mentioned earlier in the chat, like the right wing is really coming for those wins of 40 years ago all over again.
I mean, I think one of the things is that until fairly recently, we were a small part of the population. Unless you lived in San Francisco or Berkeley or New York or Chicago, you may have never have met an Asian American activist until, you know, as our populations got larger and spread more across the country, it becomes more possible. And I think that as our activism increases, I mean, I think I've been incredibly proud that throughout all the decades of since I became an activist, there have been a very powerful, serious set of organizers, of Asian American organizers. But as we become larger and more important in the political scene, and we are becoming more, and as you know, we're projected to potentially become the largest people of color at a certain point. We are the fastest growing. We are going to get more and more attention, and you can already see it in the media, in movies and TV. And it's really up to us to get ourselves organized, to organize our people, and to tell, as Manju said, to tell the stories. Until recently, I think even today, most people, unless they, you know, they know an Asian American organizer or organizers locally, even hardcore 40, 50-year organizers might have only heard of 2 or 3 Asian American organizers. Yuri Kochiyama, Yuri Kochiyama above all, and Grace Lee probably would be about the only 2 that people even heard of. But you know, that's okay. We just have to keep doing our work. And as our work has a bigger and bigger impact, we'll become better known. But of course, that's not the point.
I'm so glad you said that's not the point. I've been thinking a lot about someone named Linda Thurston, who just passed away the night before last. She was a really important, quiet, behind the scenes, brilliant Black organizer who was involved with the movement to free Mumia Abu Jamal and critical resistance um, and War Resisters League. And she played this really important role of tech and infrastructure and logistics and operations. And I feel like it's these forms of labor that um, so often get invisibilized, and yet, like, so much of the movement work that is visible and flashy would not be possible without that excellent work behind the scenes. Yeah.
Before we end up, I want to do a couple commercials. One is the song that I played is, or that was played for me, it's from an album, which is also a CD called A Grain of Sand, which you can listen to on YouTube, or it's still available to be bought from the Smithsonian Institution. I think it can be bought on, the popular online sites as well. And the whole album is powerful. And if you have never listened to it, I really recommend it. It gives you a real sense of the spirit of the times. Um, the second commercial I want to give is to Nobuko Miyamoto. The three artists who produced that CD were Chrissy Jima, Nobuko Miyamoto, and Charlie Chan. And Nobuko has continued her artistry through the decades. She is mind-boggling. She has an organization called Great Leap. Her early career was as a dancer, not a singer. She was in the famous movie West Side Story, for example, as a dancer. And she has recently produced two incredible pieces of work that have really just recently come out. One is a 2 CD album called 120,000 Stories. It is a remarkable piece of work of music. One CD is new music, relatively new music for her, some of it very new, and the other CD is some of the songs that she's done in the past. And it's also available now. It's called 120,000 Stories, 120,000 meaning the 120,000 people who were put in relocation camps. That's what the reference is. And it should be out within a month, just written an autobiography, which I think will be absolutely fabulous. If you happen to be in the LA area, and you should look up whether her organization, which is called Great Leap, is putting on any programs. I actually, as good of a singer as she is, I think she's a even more extraordinary choreographer and dancer, and just an amazing person who moves anybody who comes into connection to her. And if you want to read any of the other things I've written, I have a website, bobwingracialjustice.org. I just published a new piece called "The White Republic and the Struggle for Racial Justice," which is it's not even on my own website yet. It's on organizingupgrade.org.
Highly recommend reading everything Bob ever publishes. Such a guiding light.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing all these great resources. I did have a question about commercials at the end, but Manju, do you want to plug your things while we're plugging things?
I'm happy to plug Durham Beyond Policing always, and our campaign with Durham for All, the Tend to Transform campaign. Just put some links in the chat for donating, for becoming a member, for signing our letters around the Tend to Transform campaign, and signing up to Phone Bank every Monday and Tuesday evening. But also, I really want to lift these two questions in the chat box around how police abolition work could help or be related to Asian communities. And it feels very connected to this other question I'm seeing, that first question. Thank you, Fee. And Yuri asks, how do you overcome anti-Blackness in Asian American communities instead of trying to become the next white? And a lot about police abolition work and anti-militarized organizing I've learned from Bob. So I wonder, would you want to answer those questions first?
No, you go
How-
for it.
Really?
Yes.
You go for it.
No, you go for it. That's more
Um,
up the field of what you do than mine.
It's work you've done for the longest, and I hope you answered these questions too. But I think for me, my Asian identity and my immigrant identity is really tied up with being working class and having grown up poor. My uh, parents were the only ones in their families to have higher education. My father was the only person to get a PhD from his village at the time that he got his PhD, and he graduated barefoot. Um, it's and that kind of educational background, which probably wouldn't have been possible if he hadn't grown up in a communist state where literacy was so widely available, higher education was available to all. Um, that background made it possible to immigrate to the US, but we didn't have wealth, we didn't have we were struggling to make ends meet, and it made some really like obvious solidarities, like uh, working class solidarity with other communities of color, other immigrant communities, noticing the important work that was Black led around us, and wanting to support and join with it. Um, and and our police abolition work, our prison abolition work, it has major implications around immigration justice, around um, undocumented people being able to not live criminalized lives, but being able to be whole in community and live not in fear. Um, the reallocation of resources away from the systems that harm communities of color, particularly Black communities, particularly Latinx communities, the reallocation of those resources towards the things that help our communities thrive, affordable housing, education, healthcare, that stuff is good for all of us. And yeah, it feels like important Asian justice work to me. um, and then in terms of anti-Blackness, I mean, I feel like anti-Blackness is so deep seated in South Asian communities, and the colorism, the casteism is so entwined. Um, and I don't know that I have overcome anti-Blackness. I feel like it's like a daily fight to recognize when some form of anti-Blackness is arising in me, in my family, in my community, and finding the voice to speak up and call it out and work through it, um, and do so with compassion, with recognition that none of us were born believing in anti-Blackness or believing in white supremacy, right? Like, these are poisonous ideologies that help keep a whole elaborate power structure in place, and most of us never even meet the beneficiaries. Um, Virtually everyone we organize with has a very direct stake in dismantling anti-Blackness, and it's crucial.
I'll talk about that anti-Blackness piece. I mean, I think what Manju said is really the first step, is to recognize and acknowledge that anti-Blackness is rampant in Asian communities. Um, the word for Black people in Cantonese is Hak Gui, Black Devil. Um, and, you know, each of the different Asian countries have a different history and different kind of reasons for prejudice against people other than themselves, or even minorities within their countries. Um, and which often then translates to anti-Blackness. So I think that understanding what the roots of ethnocentrism and racism, particular to the group of people that you may be part of, as well as others, is important so that we can do this work with understanding. So I think, you know, and the fact is that if we cross boundaries with friends, lovers, political associates, whether we know it or not, somebody in our family and in our community is talking stuff about us for it. And, you know, it's not like we should go and search and get into fights with people, but we need to know this is going on. I was personally, my very first lover was a Black woman, and I got excommunicated by my grandparents, not by my parents, but my grandparents and several other members of my family. The same thing happened when they had Black partners uh, or married Black people. And, you know, this kind of work has to be done carefully, but it has to be done. It has to be understood. We have to understand it well, and we need to deal with it. And among other things, just two pieces on the front end. I mean, Asians need to know that the movement of Black people is the primary reason why most of us are in this country in the first place. I mean, we wouldn't be here, most of us. We might still be a very small number of people like we were without the civil rights movement transforming immigration law. And we also have to, and I think the other thing that's very important is, you know, who the two main beneficiaries of affirmative action, although affirmative action happened primarily because of the Black movement. The two main beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women and Asians, because of the way affirmative action got twisted was basically to allow in some people who were quote unquote qualified according to white standards and who had the college degrees. You know, it was Asians and white women. And so, you know, you have all these Asians who are against affirmative action, many of whom wouldn't be in the position they are today, maybe not even in the country, let alone in the position they are today, without the Black movement. And, you know, I guess I just think, I think this is going to become a bigger and bigger deal, because as more and more Asians are American born, they will naturally almost become more involved with people of different racial groups, and especially of Black and brown people. And so these issues are going to become, and for many have already become, kind of daily conversations. And it's not easy, but I would just give one other piece of advice that's just simple and kind of stupid, but simple. A lot of Asians are just downright scared of Black people. And, you know, people need to get over it and treat people as people and not be scared. If you like somebody, if you're interested in somebody as a friend, as a colleague, as a lover, don't be scared. Get on, you know, go about and make the relationships that you need to and want to make, and which will make your life better. And, you know, I do think there is a level of basic fear with a lot of people about dealing, especially with Black people, because of the mutual stereotypes of Blacks and Asians don't mix very well. I mean, the least common couple in the country is still an Asian man with a Black female. It's the least, you know, common couple in the world. I mean, in the United States. So I just feel like this is a big issue that we need to confront. We don't need to get crazy and get all. I guess the other thing I think, I'm sorry, this also is something Manju referred to. Asians, especially Asians who are in privileged economic positions, of which there are a lot of Asians. I mean, the median income, I just read this, blew my mind. Is it really true that the median income of Indian Americans is $125,000 a year? I mean, that just boggles my brain. But it's not just Indians. A lot of Asians come here. The Asian immigrants are largely, not strictly, but significantly from elite groups.
And we definitely see this parallel between like those Asians with wealth and their collusion with right-wing white supremacist harm here, and in people of Indian origin, Hindu supremacist movements on the subcontinent. Yeah, serious issues. I feel like the Third World Liberation Front style work that unites our decolonial fights has offered such a kind of theoretical antidote to that anti-blackness, right? It's like the idea that actually our liberation is on an international level bound up with each other, and that we actually have a lot to learn from each other's movements. Um, I mean, if you look back at other uh, anti-colonial fights from many of across our Asian diaspora, many of those movements were in conversation with and learning from and inspired by African liberation movements and Black American liberation movements here.
Yes, thank you for sharing all of that. That international piece is something that I'm especially really interested in, because I think we lose a lot when we just zone in within the US borders and like take our entire analysis from there. I think having that global perspective, the internationalist perspective, really reminds us of how like US imperialism works, how colonialism works, how global white supremacy works. So I appreciate you for uplifting that. I'm looking at the time, so would you all be down to answer one last question? Amazing. So my last thing is for folks, especially youth, who are maybe newly engaged or galvanized on social justice issues and looking for ways to get involved. What would you say to them, or what advice do you have for them?
Well, I mean, I think the first piece is that change is made by collectivities, by large numbers of people. It's not made by individuals. So people who are wanting to get involved and wanting to have impact, they have to find ways to get involved with organizations. Or, if at a certain point they get enough experience and they see a need for a new type of organization, start a new type of organization. But the point being that people need to be connected in organizations if they're ever going to have the impact and create the power to make change. And I mean, I don't think there's any formula for what anybody ought to do. Depends on what the interests and passions of that person are. I mean, your personal interest, your personal passion, together with whatever sense of strategy that you might have about what's needed, they interact for you to figure out what you ought to do. But honestly, there's so much that needs to be done that, just starting out, especially, go with what your passions are. Go with where some people, where you can create the relationships that will help you to learn and to participate.
I think I'd love to lift up what Rahi said in the chat. I think it's so important for folks that have the privilege to knowledge, unlike most Asian immigrants and undocumented folks, just based on the fact that we don't get any federal aid for education, to educate our communities in language that is accessible to them. I always try to ask myself, would my parents understand? Would my parents hear this? I appreciate the things that you all named today that aren't always named. I love that, the idea of bringing our parents and our aunties and our uncles and our grandparents and our loved ones with us. Thank you, Jim. I think my advice would be around healing shame. I feel like growing up in the States as an Asian immigrant, I had a lot of shame around appearance and food and my accent and like culture, shame of my parents' garden that was like this tropical paradise and totally embarrassing beside the lawns of our neighbors. Um, and yeah, you know, they were smuggling seeds and roots, and it was so resourceful. And I think there's just something there about like we are able to build movements that are irresistible when we learn to love ourselves and our where we come from.
Thank you for that, Manju. That was beautiful. Well, I so enjoyed hearing from both of you. Thank you so much for coming out. Seeing a lot of love and a lot of appreciation in the chat. So thank you all.
Thanks for having us, Zia, and thanks, NCAAT. If folks aren't already a member of the North Carolina Asian Americans Together, how do we join?
Yes, you can sign up for a listserv on our website at ncattogether.org. And you can email me personally if you have any questions or want to get involved, and I will get you connected. Yes, thank you, Olivia. And the last thing is also, if you want more Heritage Month events, we're having a community talent show on Thursday from 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. There's still time to submit if you do any kind of performance art or you do like written stuff and you just want to like record yourself. You can submit stuff. It's going to be very cute. Thursday, 7 to 9 p.m. But yeah, I'll let you all go. I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.